Few organizations are covered by the mythical and mysterious aura that is behind today's protagonist. In many countries, it was synonymous with the most feared established agency, the Soviet Union, as the great Eurasian and communist power. A group emerged that would act in the shadow to ensure its power. After the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the so-called K, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti is one of the most controversial intelligence agencies of its time. Covert operations, surveillance, espionage, media operations, infiltration, and much more. From its role in Stalin's Great Purges to its involvement in American pacifist movements. The Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti has left a wealth of stories and operations of which only a fraction is known. But today we are going to learn about some of them and the history of the secret intelligence and police agency of the vast Soviet Empire. This is Ronaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and for those who don't know, I remind you that we now have the New Encyclopedia in English and the New Encyclopedia in Portuguese. You can give us great support by getting involved in both platforms that you can find below, subscribing to both channels, liking the videos, leaving your comments, and watching the material that has a lot of potential. Without anything else to add, let's start with today's video. To talk about the foundation of the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti, it is necessary to go back to the days of the Russian Revolution. This revolution against the monarchy, carried out in February 1917, eventually leads, months later, to a juncture where the Bolsheviks, in October of that same year, take power after staging a coup that ends with the taking of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, and dedicate themselves to organizing a new Marxist government on the foundations of the old Russian Empire. The Bolsheviks were the most radical faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This faction had originated in 1903 during the Second Congress and had, in addition to a Marxist ideological base, a practical organization based on the idea of a small, cohesive vanguard of highly trained revolutionaries dedicated full-time to making the revolution. In the course of this revolution, the one who consolidates himself as the supreme leader is Vladimir Lenin, who plays a fundamental role in the organization of the new Bolshevik government in Petrograd, and the territorial expansion of the revolution. However, the Bolsheviks quickly begin to be questioned by other sectors of the Russian left, such as the SRs, called Social Revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks, who advocated for a more gradual and peaceful revolution. At the same time, they also receive hostility from anarchist sectors that had been excluded from participation in the revolutionary government, plus the danger represented by all the pro-Tsarist sectors that would want to carry out the counter-revolution. Several of these leftist groups begin to sabotage the Bolshevik government and start to carry out strikes and demonstrations, which are becoming increasingly violent, resulting in high human and material losses. In this regard, the Bolshevik government creates on December 20th, 1917, what would be named the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation, and Abuse of Power, close quotes, or known by its Russian acronym as the Cheka. The Cheka was the first political and military intelligence agency created during the revolution, and its main activity during its early days was to suppress strikes and demonstrations, persecute opponents and counter-revolutionaries, and dismantle any initiative to overthrow the Bolshevik government. All of this, moreover, in the context of a nascent civil war. The Cheka came to have about 100,000 agents and would carry out intense violent work to achieve these objectives. This work would reach its climax during the so-called Red Terror, reaching hundreds of thousands among detainees, prisoners, and neutralized. Among the most common tactics used by the Cheka were the confiscation of goods, home invasions, public executions, and the publication of lists with the names of the so-called enemies of the people. At the end of the revolutionary period, and with the effective establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922, Joseph Stalin begins to take the lead, and the Cheka begins to transform into the so-called open quotes, state political directory. In that same year, 1922, it is eventually modified again and definitively called the Unified State Political Directory. This in the face of the Red Army's victory in the Russian Civil War and the organization of a new Soviet stability. This directory performed the same functions as the Cheka, with technical and operational improvements in carrying out its tasks. Soon the directory begins to operate with a more formal and bureaucratic structure, which gave its actions, which remained just as violent, the necessary touch of legality. In addition, the directory incorporates for the first time a department dedicated exclusively to foreign affairs, with the aim of pursuing the exiled opposition and initiating espionage and intelligence tasks, both in allied countries and in enemy countries. The most well-known operation of the directory was the so-called Operation Trust from 1922 to 1926, which consisted of the organization of a false anti-Bolshevik movement organized by the same directory, which allowed it to locate and neutralize several sectors of the opposition. The transition between the Cheka and the directory reflects the maturation of Soviet security from a more rustic police, a true formal intelligence direction. For 1934, the directory is integrated into the so-called People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union, or Narodnyi Commissariat Vnutrenych Del for its acronym in Russian. The Commissariat becomes the supreme power in terms of security, and from there the improvements undertaken by the directory in terms of intelligence continue to be refined, incorporating new technologies and espionage techniques, eventually equating to the Gestapo in Germany or the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States. During these 30 years, the Commissariat receives through Order 00447 extraordinary powers to arrest and apply the maximum trial penalties to the so-called enemies of the state. Thus, the Commissariat not only pursues its traditional enemies, such as the czarists, anti-communists, clerics, intellectuals, peasants, wealthy, and members of the bourgeoisie, but it also pursues members of the Communist Party, the Communist International, the Army, and the Politburo of the Soviet Union, surrounded in addition to international agents seeking to destabilize its government. It is here that what some historians have called Stalin's Great Purge is carried out, in which he also gets rid of many old guard communists. Older, more internationalist Bolsheviks, like Trotsky, like those who had fought alongside him during the Russian Revolution, such as Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin. In fact, according to Trotsky, during this purge and this process, Stalin becomes a kind of counter-revolutionary reaction to Lenin, who had returned many of the country's administration to former conservative officers of Tsarism, returning to the history of the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti's precedents. After this process of Great Purge, the internal control and surveillance activity by the Commissariat continues, but in a much more moderate way. Simultaneously, the Commissariat performs remarkably in international operations. These operations range from assassinations abroad of opponents, dissidents, and personal enemies of Stalin, as was the case with the famous murder of Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in 1940, to the penetration into foreign governments, as was the case with the Second Spanish Republic before and during the Civil War. But for the Russian nation, a new great challenge was coming, which was World War II. The Commissariat carries out its usual activities for the maintenance of public order. But in addition, at this juncture, it is tasked with preventing and punishing the desertions of Soviet soldiers on the war fronts. Logically, it also carries out intelligence work, both outside and within the country, its main objective being to counteract the actions of the German Gestapo. After the war, the Commissariat continues its normal functions until 1946, when these functions are absorbed by teachers, the Ministry of State Security, and the Ministry of Interior Affairs. 7 years later, in March of 1953, with the death of Joseph Stalin as the supreme leader of the Russian nation, the Soviet intelligence and security services are restructured. The Ministry of State Security is incorporated into the Ministry of Interior Affairs, but everything concerning the secret police, intelligence, and espionage services will fall on a new agency. An agency completely separate from the Ministry of the Interior and under direct dependence of the Council of Ministers, which was the supreme governing body. This agency was created on March 13, 1954, under the name of the Committee for State Security, or by its well-known Russian acronym, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti. Now let's talk about how this intelligence agency, which is shrouded in so much international fame, worked. Contrary to various myths, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti had a very sophisticated and complex organization. It had a general management composed of a president, 1 or 2 first vice presidents, 4 to 6 vice presidents, 1 or 2 Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti representatives in each constituent federative republic of the Soviet Union, and the heads of the directorate. The Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti had about 16 directorates, each in charge of different branches of the country's security. In addition, with a prominent budget, such as the Directorate of Operations Abroad, the counterintelligence and internal political control, the armed forces and political dissent, the one of economic and industrial security, the one of telephone surveillance and communications, and the one of safeguarding government headquarters, as well as among other special tasks and functions. In this sense, legally, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti had broad functions for internal control, foreign intelligence, and the maintenance of the constitutional order of the Soviet Union. To exercise these functions, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti had a large human capital, ranging from over 100,000 to 500,000 employees, at its moments of greatest intensity, including officers, spy agents, scientists, occasional informants, and administrative staff. The process to become a spy agent or a general employee of the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti was quite selective. The Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti selected its own candidates and actively sought potential recruits in people with notable talents in sectors such as academia or public administration. As for the selection criteria, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti ensured that its agents were not easily identifiable, that is, they did not possess very distinctive features, and they had unquestionable loyalty to the party. Once recruited, those assigned to be official agents or spies had to go through solid training, which not only included physical conditioning and use of weapons, but specific skills such as infiltration and cover-up, surveillance, information analysis, spy detection, psychological manipulation and persuasion, handling of technology for surveillance and cryptography, and handling of poisonous and psychotropic substances. Agents and spies were popularly known as Chekists, continuing with the nickname that had been given to the members of the old Cheka. The perception of the average Soviet citizen about Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti officials could be quite dichotomous or contradictory. They were seen by many as true national heroes, also rewarded with medals and decorations for their bravery and work in favor of the nation. While to other Russians, the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti rather inspired a continuous fear and distrust. But beyond their grim appearance, largely founded on their military-type uniform, even though many dressed in civilian clothes, the aura that was covering the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti officials comes from the same stories that came out of the performance of their duties. Many of these stories are true and confirmed, while some debate their certainty. But the truth is that these feats of the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti officials were earning them a reputation, like, for example, being possessors of the great network of Soviet spies scattered all over the world. Which, beyond its actual size, it is true that the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti had spies in several Western countries, or in many cases, at least agents who collected information, whether of a public or secret nature, often with the knowledge of the governments where they operated. In this way, during their decades of operation, they are forming a record of actions which include forced disappearances, eliminations using silent weapons, kidnappings, harassment and intimidation, infiltrations, use of methods that included physical abuse or sleep deprivation, poisoning. Even the use of female sexual spies who seduced their victims to extract information. and a series of tasks that made a large part of the population feel respect, admiration, or fear towards the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti and its officials. In addition to this reality, throughout its 37 years, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti carried out several notable operations. During the 50s, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti undertakes operations such as Operation Trosh and Operation Pantomime, which are carried out in 1956. And their objective was to pursue the enemies of the state through arrest, exile, and intimidation, and by disseminating information contrary to their person, using, for example, international conferences. On its part, outside the borders of Russia, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti also gets involved, for example, infiltrating anti-communist movements within its satellite countries, such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, a matter that helps it identify and crush subversives against the Soviet Union. In turn, it supports revolutionary governments such as that of Cuba and several African countries in the 60s. For its part, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti carries out operations that stand out like Operation Pandora, where it seeks to incite racial tensions in the United States to provoke conflicts between radical groups like the Ku Klux Klan and African-American militants. Likewise, the infiltration within the CIA leads it to capture double agents and to the acquisition of vital information about American operations. As for internal order, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti carries out Operation Horizon between 1967 and 1968, which infiltrates and dismantles foreign spy networks, using tactics such as repatriation and private visits to gather information. For the 70s and 80s, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti also carries out notable operations, among these Operation Rian from 1981, which stands out for a massive effort to discover possible nuclear attack plans by the United States. The Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti also plays a crucial role in the invasion of Afghanistan, providing support to Afghan factions and carrying out intelligence operations. On the international stage, the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti during these years is involved in the murder of Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov through a Riken poisoning device. In addition, it infiltrates and covertly supports pacifist and anti-nuclear movements within the West, with the aim that these movements would help to militarily weaken the enemy, promoting not only pacifism but nuclear disarmament. The Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti also collaborates with other agencies such as East Germany's Stasi to control dissidents and prevent opposition movements. Its influence also extends to Africa, where it supports independence movements and uses espionage tactics to counteract American influence. It also sought infiltration into various Western media outlets and industrial espionage to steal Western technology. Despite the fact that the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti was an agency on par with the American CIA, the British Military Intelligence, Section 5, or the Israeli Mossad, by the early 1990s, it fails to counteract the immense changes that were taking place in the world and in the Soviet Union. With the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in 1985, the reforms begin to materialize, like perestroika and glasnost, which were opening the Russian economy to the increasing flows of international capital and also opening its political system. The Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti is overwhelmed by Western influences and the emergence of dissident and nationalist movements within Russia. All of this alongside economic changes that the country had been experiencing for some time, along with respective cultural changes. In this context, in the face of the imminent dissolution of what was known as the Soviet Union, a coup attempt occurs, August 19, 1991. Led by orthodox factions within the Communist Party and supported by the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti, which sought to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, however, the coup fails disastrously and accelerates the collapse of the Soviet Union. Finally, the 6th of November, 1991, so fatal for enthusiasts of the Soviet Union, the agency known as the Komitet Gosudarbstvennoy Bezopasnosti is officially dissolved, only for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to inevitably disintegrate on the 26th of December of that same year. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Russian Federal Republic, the functions of the former Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti will be taken over by the new Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, or Federal Security Service as it is known in Russian, thus closing a 37-year history of intelligence, surveillance, espionage, repression, legends, and mysteries. The Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti is a protagonist of a historical time as complex as the Cold War, which, like the CIA in the United States, as an agency acquires a power that sometimes surpassed the figure of the head of state itself, at least in appearance, covered with a number of legends and stories that continue to mark the popular imagination, not only of Russia, but of the world to this day. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I remind you that below you can get the new encyclopedia in English and the new encyclopedia in Portuguese. Like all the videos on those channels, share them with your acquaintances, watch the material that is really worth it, and, well, subscribe to both platforms. Thank you all very much, and God bless.